All right. So we're going to pick up this lecture this week on developmental across the lifespan, developmental psychology across the lifespan. We're going to get into a little bit more than psychology. We're going to talk a little bit about biology and genetics, because those very much play into how we develop as humans. As you can imagine, if there's something genetically wrong that our brain doesn't form correctly, or our speech doesn't form correctly, then that could affect us as far as learning from in formal institutes like school, high school, college, so on and so forth. So everybody's a little bit different, but they might need to tailor how that person is receiving that information or acquiring that information, or using more hands-on approach as opposed to just whatever the standard way of passing that information on to that student. So anyway, those things kind of tend to play out, and it could be more physiological issues or organic diseases or symptoms, as opposed to just not being good at studying or something like that. So, and we'll talk about that, how that looks. So we will need to cover a little bit of the biological components of this. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so we can go along with this. So as promised, we're going to talk about development across the lifespan, which is chapter 8 in your book. So one of the things that is really interesting about lifespan development is that, we can do a pretty good job of running experiments and running research on individuals and groups of individuals to kind of get a sense of what's happening in the culture, in society, in localized communities and villages, so on and so forth. But lifespan development, it's a whole different type of research, because instead of taking a snapshot of what's happening with behaviors and observations, what we tend to do with lifespan is look at the whole picture from cradle, what we call cradle to grave. So that's from when a person is born to a person's death. Okay. So looking at that trajectory and their development along a lifespan takes a lot of work and a lot of patience, as you can imagine, but it can be done, and it has been done. Okay, so human development, as we know, is the scientific, as your book says, is the scientific study of changes in people from conception until death. Okay, I misspoke earlier. I said birth. Okay, it actually starts much earlier. Human development does start much earlier. It starts at conception, when the egg is fertilized and the embryo attaches to the uterine wall. That's when development starts. Okay. And as we know, any kind of teratogens or any kind of toxins within the environment can significantly impact the development from that point on. So actually, development does occur from conception to death, not cradle to grave, as I previously mentioned. All right. So looking at how we design our research, we actually look at longitudinal studies. And if you remember from chapter 2, when we talked about how psychology research is conducted, longitudinal studies were one of them. Okay. So looking at this individual, Armando Garcia, look at going from, let's see, what they started their research in 1994 when he was just a baby, looking at cognitive skills, social skills, moral, physical, and then I don't think there was any moral. I don't think they were looking at, I don't understand why they have moral for a baby. But then 2002, they did another snapshot of him, and they looked at more social skills and physical, so on and so forth. And then by the time he was 2014, which would have been 20 years old now, we've got pretty much 20 years of data that we were able to collect on Armando. Okay, so that's what longitudinal studies is, looking at one individual over a very long period of time. Now they have cross-sectional studies, which they might look at a group of individuals within some kind of social class or some kind of population, and they span that over long periods of time. But taking snapshots of group 1 at a young age, and then looking at group 2 within that culture or that population at middle age, and then toward maybe group 3 would be their elderly, and comparing that data to see what likenesses occur. Not nearly as accurate because you're not getting the same individual over long periods of time. But what is the drawback? What is the drawback of studying one individual from conception until death? What do you think?
It takes a really long time.
Takes a really long time, and then they might outlive the researcher, right? Because if the researcher, maybe if they're 18 years old and the researcher is, and they started researching earlier on, and they probably don't have the skills to do that. They're going to have to pretty much make a lifelong commitment to that, or pass that research on to somebody else. So doing that, while it would be ideal to track somebody from conception till death, is just not possible. Not at least not for one person. Now, somebody could pass that on, but it gets to be very expensive, and you don't know even if the data is going to be worth it. So reminded of the movie Truman. Anybody see the movie Truman Show? Is that on our list of movies?
No, I don't believe so.
Did anybody ever see Truman Show?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of you have seen it. Yeah. So that was kind of a neat concept. So what they did with Truman, it was a character on this film, is they created this bubble, and it's a great social psychology one that I like to use, and I think even developmental, I think it would apply to. But they create this bubble, and when this baby is born, he's born to this film studio. The film studio adopted him and created this world around him, made it kind of his reality until he was, I think, in his 30s or 40s or something like that. All of the people around him were actors. Pretty much this whole bubble, his whole town was a stage, and everybody knew it except him, and it was a televised show. So anyway, it was just kind of neat to see the amount of money and effort that people put in just to create a show for the general public. And seeing his natural responses to it. So anyway, that would be an example of a longitudinal study, and it can be quite uninteresting and expensive and time consuming. So just one thing to note about that. So cross-sectional study, all groups in 2019, looking at snapshots of young people at group 1, middle age, group 2, and group 3, less expensive and less intrusive, and probably a little bit more feasible. The note to make with nature versus nurture, I told you this topic would come up again, and it has, because we look at that, especially in terms of developmental psychology. How do we develop? How do we form our morals and our thoughts and our behaviors? Is it based because we are genetically predispositioned to act that way, or think that way, or behave that way? Or is it something that we learned from our environment? This is something we've battled back and forth for ages as to whether we're born with it or whether we're taught those behaviors or those ways. So anyway, most developmental psychologists agree that development is a product of an interaction between both nature and nurture. Now, last week we talked about intelligence. Is intelligence genetic? Is it hereditary? Or is it something that we get from our environment? It's both, right? We have to have the ability, the capacity to remember things. We have to have the capacity to be able to solve problems. And if we don't have those in our environment, if we don't have a rich environment to do that, then we will probably not gain those skills and gain those abilities. So anyway, it is a balance between both. We have to have it in our environment, and we have to have the capacity to have that learn that ability. Okay. So what are the basic building blocks of development here? As we talked about in previous chapters, we've got several genetic components, right? Looking at DNA, looking at recessive genes, right? Those are genes that are within that family that may not have may skip generations, right? So you may have a child who has blonde hair, but mom and dad both have brown hair. If you look back through history, you'll probably see that one of his distant relatives or ancestors probably had blue hair, and that skipped generations for whatever reasons. So we call that recessive genes. Okay, so maybe savantism or genius or high in intellect or something is within that family's gene. And it may skip generations, or it may be passed down for generations, whatever that may be. We also see that, unfortunately, with genetic disorders, like intellectual disabilities. You can have two relatively normal, intelligent parents, father and mother, and because of that recessive gene, that may produce intellectual disabilities or autism spectrum disorder or something like that. Okay, so something to keep in mind. All right, so genetic is just looking at the science of inherited traits. Is really DNA is the molecule that contains that blueprint. I'm not going to actually go through all these. All right, so I just know that hereditary components, it could result in higher ability to learn and develop, or inhibited ability to learn and develop. Okay, so some chromosome disorders, some things that we talked about that might be recessive genes or dominant genes or whatever that might be passed down, might be Down syndrome. Okay, Klinefelter's syndrome is another one, as well as Turner syndrome. So those are things that are within the genetic component or within the chromosome itself. Some genetic disorders, it might be PKU or cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. These are things that develop later in life. They might be born with them, but it might also be something that just shows up later. Okay. All right, so dominant versus recessive genes and PKU. Looking at the mother and the father. Biologically speaking, the mother carries the recessive PKU, and dad does not carry the recessive PKU. So what we might see as a result is no child will be afflicted with PKUs, because we look at it as mostly being the gene that the father carries. Okay, although 2 and 4 will carry the recessive gene. So if the mother has a recessive gene and the father does not, we would see a likelihood of the recessive gene being passed down. And if one of those kids, one of their children are male, they may likely pass. They might see that PKU show up in future children. Okay. Likewise, if you see this slide below that, mom carries the recessive PKU, and father also carries that. 1 in 4 children will inherit 2 dominant genes and will not have PKU. Okay. All right. So those are just some genetic components to think about. And many of you that are going to be working in the field, you're going to likely encounter people that are going to have questions about, well, what should we have children? And if we do have children, what are we going to do? Because we know that Down syndrome might run in our family. Now, even though mom and dad may not have that, it still is a real situation that they may do. And hopefully we'll have time at the end of this class to have an exercise to, what would you do? What would you do as a counselor? If somebody came to you and said, we're thinking about doing this, what are some things you can do to guide us? And so start thinking about that, how you'll have that conversation. If somebody comes into you and says, we have PKU within our family, or we have Down syndrome, or MS or something, and how are we going to make an informed decision as to whether to start a family? All right. So again, getting into the psychology of why we do what we do and how we develop, it's important to understand how fertilization occurs, how conception occurs, right? I'm not going to give you the whole sex talk here. You all went through health class, so I'm pretty sure you know how people become pregnant, but it starts off with an ovum, with an egg. And within that, the fertilization occurs, and DNA chemical reaction occurs that produces a zygote. And this is the cell resulting from an egg, and eventually develops into many cells, okay, forming what we eventually have as the baby. Some great little graphics here. So what happens when we have identical twins? So do any of you know of any identical twins, or are any of you identical twins yourselves?
I have it in my family.
You have it in your family?
Yeah, my grandpa's brothers were twins.
Okay, were they the only twins?
That I know of, yeah.
Okay. You usually if families are capable of carrying twins, sometimes it might just be, you know, randomness. It may not be necessarily that prominent, but usually if there are twins on both sides of the family, that increases the likelihood that that couple will produce a twin at least, or carry on that recessive gene, so that other kids, their offspring might have twins. Okay, so it does happen. So when identical twins happens, what happens is that there's a split of the zygote, and basically initially that we'll see two forms split off, two of those cells split off, and then they start developing independently. Okay, so fraternal twins is a little bit different. So one thing I want to point out with identical twins, it comes from one ovum. It comes from one zygote. So that zygote has all of the building blocks, all of the chromosomes and genetic materials it needs to form a human. And when that splits, you have two identical chromosomes doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. So that's what, and they call that monozygotic, because it's a one zygote. When you have fraternal twins, you have dizygotic, which is two zygotes. And they usually have different genetic material. So their chromosomes are not the same. Their DNA does not have a similar marker with fraternal twins. They're similar, but not identical like identical twins, because there's no split. They're just two zygotes that have formed independently.
I'm a fraternal twin.
You're a fraternal twin. Okay. Is it okay if I ask you a couple of questions about it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What did you? What are some characteristics that are very similar between you and your twin?
Well, she and I do have some kind of similarities in our face, but we're still very different. So,
Okay.
and I still have blonde hair. We both have blonde hair. So.
Okay. Okay. So some facial features, and
Yeah.
you know, we can probably mark that up too. So it's really not very different than having a sibling that was born either earlier or later. Okay. It is very much a sibling. Now, there are many things that make fraternal twins closer than siblings born at different areas, and that could be because of developmental differences. The mother might have not had the same kind of nurturing or nourishment. The stress level might be different. So what we know about fraternal twins is that in a vacuum, they're born at exactly the same conditions as the mother is able to produce. Okay, even though they're quite different with chromosomes, they're going through the same conditions. So
I was an in vitro baby.
Okay, okay, and that happens a lot. What you're talking about is IVF, in vitro fertilization, and what occurs with that is they put multiple zygotes into the woman's uterus in hopes that at least one or two of them take, because it's kind of a scatter shot. You know, they try to the goal is to get the mother pregnant in conditions where she normally would not be pregnant. Either the father isn't able to produce enough sperm to catch, or the mother doesn't have a womb that is or a uterus that is capable of sustaining life. So IVF is usually used to increase the likelihood of pregnancy. So sometimes multiple children, multiple zygotes become fertilized, and as a result, fraternal twins. It's not unheard of that people have 6, 7, or 8 kids at a time. I mean, it's unbelievable to imagine that, but it does happen. So anyway, so with the 3 stages of development, okay, you have your germinal stage, which happens the first 2 weeks after fertilization. And this is when the zygote moves down the uterus and begins to implant in the lining, okay? That's important because we want to establish that connection. We want to establish that cellular connection so that the mother can start passing nutrients to and from the baby, the embryo. Okay. Then you have the embryonic stage. So from about 2 to 8 weeks after fertilization, that's when we start seeing some hormonal shifts, because now the body, the mother's body is fully aware that she is indeed pregnant. And during that stage, all the major organs and structures of the baby start to develop at a cellular level, not really fully functional just yet, but it does start to form the heart, the chambers of the heart and liver, and start to protect them in a way that they are going to be self-sustaining. So the mother's body is going through some changes, and the embryo starts to build in sustainability. Okay, so that happens in the embryonic stage. And then we have the fetal stage, which is from about 8 weeks after conception until the birth of the baby. Now, what's interesting to know is that many pregnancy tests usually pick up about 2 to 4 weeks into the pregnancy, especially the over-the-counter, what they call the P sticks, where the mother would be able to urinate, and based on the hormones in her body, they would be excreted and detectable at that. Now, it's not 100% foolproof. There are a lot of women that use those sticks, those pregnancy sticks, that it won't detect for whatever reason. The hormones just aren't balanced right, or they're not excreting through the urine or something, and it might give them a false negative. So that's the fetal stage from 8 weeks to after conception until the birth of the baby. And what we see is this explosion of cellular development. They start to develop their brains, their spine, their limbs. Okay, and eventually, we have what resembles, usually around 4 or 5 weeks, or I'm sorry, 4 to 5 months into the pregnancy, we have a well-formed human being within that mother's uterus. And that continues to develop. And it's important that there are protections, that nutrients are still flowing, that teratogens or toxins are not being introduced, because that's the period where the brain starts doing most of its development. Okay, and that's important. And we'll talk about teratogens here in this slide here. So teratogens, just put simply, are toxins. Okay, and they are toxins that could be intentionally or unintentionally, accidentally introduced into the mother's system. And as we know, the embryo and the fetus start to share whatever nutrients that mother has. So anything bad in her body will also be affecting that fetus. Okay, so for example, if the mother is exposed to measles, mumps, or rubella, right, blindness, deafness, heart defects, and brain damage can occur if the mother goes through that while she's pregnant. Smoking marijuana, we know some of the effects might produce a child, like a temperament in the child that's irritable, nervousness. They might have tremors. Infant is easily disturbed and startled. So we might see that as a result of a mother using any kind of substances. And same for cocaine. Alcohol, we have linked to fetal alcohol syndrome, which is an intellectual disability that shows delayed growth and even facial deformities. Learning difficulties usually occur with alcohol. So that's why we advise, there's a lot of studies out there. How many of you heard that 1 glass of beer or wine is okay for pregnant women, for a pregnant mother?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah,
Okay.
like every once
Awesome.
in a while, but not like every day.
Okay. And there are a lot of European studies that focus on that, because especially in France, I mean, wine is pretty much part of the daily diet, as is beer in Germany. So we do know that there's not really an uptick in fetal alcohol syndrome in European countries versus American or people that don't use alcohol regularly. So there's really not an overwhelming amount of data that shows either way that a glass of wine or beer a day will produce fetal alcohol syndrome. There's not really enough that supports that. However, most people that engage in that kind of behavior usually are doing other things, such as smoking heavily or doing other recreational drugs, or maybe not focusing on nourishment of their baby. So that's kind of lumped in with that. And I think that that's probably what we focus on in the medical. If we were looking at a medical professional might say, well, no alcohol consumption whatsoever, because we know that alcohol does lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. And if we can refrain from that, that's usually the best option, because yeah, some people can't go out and just have one drink. They go out and get sloshed, which we know would poison the baby and increase the likelihood of SAS or fetal alcohol syndrome. All right. With nicotine, we show that nicotine has low birth weight, short stature, intellectual disabilities, and even, it's not listed on here, but even in a proneness to asthma. And that could be for multiple reasons. That could be because of the teratogen, the agent that's in the body, and may have difficulty properly forming the lungs. But we also know that this also might be an environmental issue. If that child is born to an environment that is heavy in smoke, they may also, because after they're born, their lungs continue to develop. If they have those toxins within their air, they're constantly breathing that might stunt the growth of their lungs as well. Okay, mercury, vitamin A deficient, or high doses of vitamin A can be problematic, so it's important. Caffeine, low birth weight, miscarriages, toxoplasmosis, brain swelling, high water temperatures could affect neural tube defects, right? Which would lead to potential brain injuries in that child, or in that fetus. Okay.
What is sorry, Professor, what is the high water temperature? What is?
So being in prolonged high water, like hot tubs, high temperature hot tubs.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
High water temperatures, not high water. Yeah, so being it's okay to get baths. It's okay to get warm baths, but hot tubs generally,
Okay.
yeah, they operate like 105 degrees plus, which is significantly higher than a person's natural body weight or body temperature. So it could lead to miscarriages and other issues. So that's why we suggest not much exposure to high temperatures. All right. So that's pretty much it for the development of the fetus. So what happens when the child is ready to be born? We go through the birthing process, and I'm kind of skipping over the psychology of what the parents go through, because we're mostly focusing on the individual and their lifespan. So a couple things that we look at: we have the APGAR scale, which looks at different things and mile markers of where children should be based on their physical age. Okay, so we look at reflexes. We want to make sure that they're neurologically developing their reflexes, because reflexes are important for survival. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we need reflexes? What do you think?
To react to any dangerous things, or
Right.
Yeah.
These reflexes are hardwired into us. They're innate, they're instinctual. These are things that we come out of the womb automatically doing. Much like if you know any horses or deer or cows, usually they're born right out of the womb, and within minutes they're standing up. They need that to survive. Humans, not so much. It takes us much longer, up to a year, to actually begin walking. But so we're not capable of doing that. But there are certain things that we need to be able to do instinctually. We need to learn how to step. We need to learn how to grasp things with our fingers and have that, right? We need to have that Moro reflex, that startle. So if you clap your hands in front of a newborn, they're going to blink. They're going to be startled. That's normal. because if they don't have that, they may not react to fearful situations, which could decrease the likelihood of survival if it's truly a danger. Sucking or suckling is necessary for survival for food, right? Coming out of the mother's womb, the first thing they're going to do is attach to her breasts, and that's necessary for them to gain nutrients. If they don't have that, then that could also be problematic. Okay, so lost my where's my mouse? Lost my mouse. I apologize. Okay, there we go. So anyway, looking at the nervous system and healthy, making sure that those reflexes are healthy are important. And usually a doctor has a scale to make sure that they're testing the right things at the right age. Okay. All right, we're going to skip the video on this one. All right, probably not this child's most photogenic moment, but you know, looking at the physical development and sensory development, I don't know if there's anything actually wrong with, I'm going to guess her, because she has the standard pink bow, general, whatever. So anyway, some other things that the doctor may look for is their taste of touch, taste, and smell. Their sense of touch, taste, and smell. Are they well developed? Are they making sour faces like this little girl here in the picture? Probably parents thought it was funny to put a drop of lemon in her mouth, right? Now doctors don't usually do that, but they, you know, they'll ask the parents if they're able to report. Are they reporting to sweet things, right? Now, why is taste, touch, and especially taste and smell? Why do you think that that's important to develop earlier on? What is the function of taste in survival?
So we don't eat anything that might be like poisonous or like rotten or something.
Right. It might be, yeah, we want to return to the things that are going to be good for us. And likewise, we, hold on a second. Sorry. We might want to make sure that they're returning to whatever it is that's nourishing their bodies, right? Hearing, you know, we want to make sure hearing earlier on is occurring, because if that's not, that may indicate some other kind of developmental disorders or not disorders, but learning impairments. Vision, same thing. If those rods and cones are not developed properly about 6 months and they're not able to see color, that could indicate that there might be some issues with vision, and we'd have to address those earlier on so that the child is not developmentally delayed. Okay, because we do know that children without the sense of hearing or vision or both, they still have the ability to learn like children that have those faculties. However, it's important to detect that earlier on so that they're not delayed in getting the correct environment that they need in order to thrive and learn. Okay. So physical development and motor milestones. You know, looking back at the APGAR scale, you know, some of the major physical milestones for infancies, you know, 2 to 4 months, we expect them to be raising their head and chest. Okay, so moving around, developing those muscles and motor skills in order to start looking around. As we get into Jean Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, one of the things that Jean Piaget talks about is he likens children to being little scientists, little discoverers. And in order to do that, they need to be able to move around and act autonomously within their environment. If they can't pick up things, or they can't look around, or they can't respond to something that they hear or see, then that could be problematic and inhibit their development. So right around 2 to 4 months, we're going to see them start to raising their heads and chests. And right around 6 to 7 months, they should be sitting up without support. And these are all things that, again, a physician, a pediatrician will check for. 7 to 8 months, we should see them crawling by themselves. Okay, and then 8 to 18 months walking. Now, it is important to know that without the intervention of parents or caregivers, children usually do this on their own anyway. They learn to do it on their own. Okay, they see others doing it, but my point is, you know, we have some parents that kind of push children to do things above these milestones. And while that might be worth bragging rights to your friends and family, it could actually be detrimental to the child, especially when it gets to potty training and writing and other skills. So it's important to understand that these things happen automatically. Language happens automatically as long as it's within that environment and they have an environment that they can do that. They'll learn to do it themselves. And walking is no exception. So right around 8 to 18 months, we'll see them start to walk. Okay, as promised, Jean Piaget in his theory is that children are not little adults, but instead they think quite differently about the world. They start putting building blocks together, information, lumping information together to make it more sensical to whatever it is that they're trying to, whatever goals they're trying to meet. So if a child is trying to build something tall, they're going to look at the blocks as with those flat edges as, oh, I can stack these. And they start realizing what the function of those blocks are to make something tall, as an example. So they do this thought process through a bunch of schemes and assimilation and accommodation. And we're not going to go through all of those. Your book has a pretty good definition of those, but basically it's putting things into generalization. So for example, I think I used this example with this class. My son used to call, we had a dog and he knew anything that walked around on 4 legs and was furry was probably dog. And our dog was black at the time. So we were riding along a field one day and there was a cow out there, a black cow. I think it's Black Angus. I think so. I don't know if it has anything to do with the color or not, but what do you think he called? He's never seen a cow before, but he knew the word. He called it goggy instead of doggy. So he said goggy. What do you think he called the cow out in the field when he saw it?
A dog.
Yeah, he said goggy, like he referenced, he thought it was a dog. So those are the scheme in his mind. Within that scheme, anything with 4 legs and fur and black was probably a dog. That's what he had learned. So that was assimilation. Now, accommodation, what we're doing is we're breaking that. So we talked to him about it. We said, no, we said that this is a dog and that is a cow. Cows go moo, dogs go woof. So we started breaking off the differences. And at that point, he started learning that not everything with 4 legs, dark coat and fur is a dog, but they could be very different animals. So we started branching out that. And that's what's really great about a child's mind is it's very flexible. You get to our age and we get into these fixations because we've lived an entire life thinking certain things and with that assimilation, we've assimilated all that we pretty much can. And then deviating from that tends to be a little bit harder for us because we've gone so long with doing that. But children's minds are so flexible and there's so much plasticity that they're able to deviate and think of things a little bit differently. All right. So with Jean Piaget's model, he developed 4 stages of cognitive development. See if it comes up here. Good, it does. All right. So the 4 stages, as you see here, are sensorimotor, preoperational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Now, one thing that I will caution you on is that these are not hard and fast rules for the timeline, the age range that these children fall under, because it could be a little bit different. It might vary by a year or 2, or maybe even more when you get into some of the older ages, right? So, for example, birth to 2 years old, we have children who explore using their senses and motors, as the name indicates for stage 1 is sensory motor. So they're using their motor abilities to explore the world around them. They're looking at things that don't make sense to them. They spend what we call gaze time, gazing at something that they're trying to study, something that doesn't look quite right, or they're trying to commit to memory. So within that age group, we'll see them doing a lot more exploration in motor senses and those abilities. Interestingly enough, so Jean Piaget's work came very similar, especially in the sensory motor stage, to Sigmund Freud's psychosexual development stages. And the first stage of Freud's psychosexual stage is oral. Now, what does oral have to do with development? Freud was notorious for looking at things very sexualized, right? He looked at the reasons why we do everything is because we are somehow wanting to interact sexually with that object or something, right? So that was kind of the premise of his development. Now, a lot of what he did develop, we don't use anymore because we know that not everything is sexual or traumatizing or even repressed for that matter. But we have adopted some things from his theories, which I'll talk about when we get into personality theories, such as like the idea of the subconscious and unconscious mind. So anyway, he kind of Freud had this part right, where we do explore the world with our mouth, right? Because we are developing our taste buds. We're developing a sense of what things taste like with texture, and what better senses to have than in our lips and on our tongues. So that's probably one of the reasons why kids are constantly putting toys in their mouth or putting things in their mouth that probably shouldn't go there, right? Like garbage or dog food, or I don't know if any of you have kids, but my kids used to go right for the dog food. I don't know why. So we had to portion that out and cover up the dog food because they wanted to explore. Grossed us out. So anyway, one of the challenges, one of the milestones that we know that children, when they overcome the stage 1 sensory motor stage, is when they have mastered object permanence. How many of you have ever played peekaboo with an infant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Yep.
Are they not so thrilled to see you when you come back into the picture? So peekaboo is when you cover your face with something or your hands, and then you come back in the picture. What is their reaction?
They're happy and like
Yeah, there's-
laughing.
Yeah, they're happy because they thought you disappeared, right? So in a child's mind, in an infant's mind, if they haven't mastered the sensory motor stage, they think that things that they don't see doesn't exist. So what does that mean? That means if something isn't within their visual range, then it doesn't exist anymore. And they've done lots of studies, like I said, the gaze study, looking at an object that travels behind like a barrier or a wall. We would normally expect to see it come out the other side when that barrier is no longer covering up the tracks or covering up whatever ledge that object is rolling on, right? Children don't think that way. They don't see an object as moving. They'll keep staring at that same section and then maybe look off in a random direction. So a child that has mastered object permanence will either look for that object once it's disappeared, or they will, if it's something that goes behind a barrier, they'll look on the other side of the barrier, anticipating it to reappear. So that's when we know a child has mastered object permanence. And like I said, that usually happens right around age 2, give or take a year. If it goes beyond age 3, usually doctors will start to consider, maybe there's something intellectually going on that may not be right. And they would have maybe have a close eye on other developmental issues. But in general, you'll see it right around 2 years old. Infants usually develop their sense of object permanence. And I have some great videos on our website for you to check out that demonstrate some of these concepts here. So stage 2 is the preoperational stage. And this happens, again, right around 2 to 7 years old. And within this stage, some of the mile markers of this stage is egocentrism. Egocentrism means that ego being self, centrism meaning centralized or focused. So they're very focused on themselves. Now, just to give you some ideas of what that might look like, I had, I'm thinking back when I had some of my kiddos that I was working with. I had a 5-year-old, we'll call her Elle. So Elle came into my office and we were doing an evaluation on her because she had some family issues that were going on, and we just wanted to see if she had any delayed learning issues or disabilities or anything like that. So anyway, Elle came into my office and she was talking, telling me stories about her dog and her family, and what she had for what she had at preschool. She was in preschool at the time. And then she was telling me about Billy. I like to use Billy a lot. Billy is her friend, and Billy, they played a lot. And I asked her, well, what kind of snacks do you like? And she says fruit snacks. She likes the fruit drops. And I said, what kind of snacks does Billy like? And she said fruit snacks. And I said, what kind of snacks do you think I like? What do you think her response was?
Fruit snacks.
Fruit snacks, right? Because she's in that stage where everything that's in her mind must apply to everybody else, right? They don't understand that other people think differently or behave differently. Whatever it is that she thinks and acts and processes is what everybody else is doing. They haven't stepped outside of themselves. So whatever it is that she sees, she thinks that I can see too. And there's some great demonstrations that show how that works as well on the videos. So conservation issues. So with conservation, I got a great story with this one. I'm hoping, I think my kids subscribe to this channel, and I don't think they watch this, because if they did, they would know how much I talk about them and use them as examples. But they're great. It's great to use them as examples because they're very similar in age. They're about a year apart, and they grew up being best buddies. So they kind of had the same, moving around with the military and the same, being around family at the same time. They had very similar friends at similar ages. So anyway, I like to use them a lot in my examples. So I'll use conservation bias or conservation as a law of conservation is what it's called by Piaget. But what they look at with conservation is, can their mind rationalize quantities differently based on size, shape, and spacing? Okay, so I think, do we have we do have an example here. So just to kind of give you my personal example here is, yep, okay, they don't have a slide for this one. So my personal example is my son, who is about a year older than my daughter. We were sitting down at the table and we were having pizza, and my daughter hasn't really mastered picking up pizza and eating it from the crust. My son had, and I think they were about 5 and 6 years old. So we cut up the pizza for my daughter so that she could use her fork, because she was just mastering using the fork and feeding herself. So they might have been a little bit younger than 5 and 6, but anyway. So we cut up the pizza into smaller chunks, and my son put down his pizza and he was upset. Why?
Because he didn't get the same treatment as her at the time.
He thought that she had more pizza. Why is that? Why do you think she had more pizza? The same slice. Hers was cut up. So
because she had more pieces.
Yeah, she had more pieces. So he, at that age, was learning how to count, and he knew that she had 5 pieces and he had 1. So he was upset because he didn't have 5 pieces of pizza. So yeah, and we had to explain that to him, that it was a teaching moment for him to learn about conservation. We pieced hers back together like a puzzle and showed him that it's the same thing without lines, and helping him realize that just because you spread it out doesn't mean that it's more. Just because quantity is higher doesn't necessarily mean that it's more, right? And they've done this example with the conservation experiment here, where you have 2 lines of equal pennies. And I have a video that shows this on our D2L. But if you asked a child which of those lines are different, or if they're the same, a child will say they're the same. Now, the same amount. Now, if you put that same formation and you spread out that top line, like you see on the second image here, you'll ask that child which line has more pennies. What do you think that child that hasn't mastered conservation yet, what do you think they're going to answer? Top line or bottom line? Which line has more pennies?
Line.
Right. The top one, right? Because it's longer. It looks longer. Even if you have them count them, I've seen this happen with conservation. Even if you have them count those pennies, they will count the exact same number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you ask them again, which one has more pennies? Again, they'll tell you the top line because they think just because it's spread out, it means it's more. So that's the idea behind conservation. Like I said, check out those videos. It'll show some great examples of that.
Professor, do you mind go back 1, 2 slides? I wanted to take a.
That one?
No, one more. One more. Oh, stage 1. Yeah. All right, I'm good. Thank you.
You're good? Okay. And these slides are located on D2L too. So, all right. So stage 3 is our concrete operations. Once a child has started to master, volume, what does volume look like? Like volume of liquid or volume of some kind of material, they'll start to be able to work those images in their head. And one of the things that we use is the tall glass, fat glass experiment with children to see if they've mastered that. Similar to what we saw with the penny scenario is we'll have a child, we'll have 2 glasses. We'll have a beaker full of liquid, and then we'll have a tall glass, and then we'll have a wide glass. And we'll dump the same amount in each one and ask the child which one has more. Usually they'll tell us which glass has the most, do you think?
All glass.
The tall glass. Yeah, absolutely. Because they look at it as a size difference. If it's taller, it must be more. If it's wider, it must be more. So anyway, they will erroneously say that the tall glass has more liquid in it than the short, fatter glass. Right around 7 years old, they start to realize that that's not the case, that the tall glass, even if they witness watching putting that same amount in, they will likely say that they both have the same amount right around concrete operation stage. So they've mastered the law of conservation, right? Classification and concrete logic, they're able to do math problems independently. So they're looking at subtraction, addition, division. They're starting to be able to conceptualize, start forming mental representations in their heads. Still not thinking in abstract yet, but they're starting to develop hypothesis, the hypothetical situations. So if I put a round block into a container and I get rewarded for that somehow, I might also get rewarded for putting a square block in that same container, right? So they're starting to learn a little bit more intricate operations, and we see that happen with the concrete operation stage. All right. Again, still not abstract thinking, so they're not able to piece things together as well. But that happens usually around 12 years of age. Well, we'll start to see abstract thinking happen, and analogies. What an example of an analogy would be, a dog is to a kennel as a cat is to, it might be a bad example. How about a dog is, try to think of a good, man, I'm not good at analogies apparently. Might have to go back to stage 3 of Piaget's operations. Okay, how about a mouse is to a computer as a stylus is to what? You know what a stylus is?
Yeah, and styluses are used in a lot of different things nowadays.
Yeah, like a phone or a tablet or something like that, right? So using that analogy, because we know that a mouse helps us with pointing and input for a computer. So what else we know the stylus is an input to something, so we're able to kind of think outside the box and come up with options for that, right? So hypothesis testing. What if, what if I were to do this or say this? What would happen? So we see a little bit more experimentation happening. They're taking what they've learned in different scenarios and applying it to newer order stuff. An example I like to use for that, especially with college students. What was studying like in high school? How many of you are right out of high school? Is studying in high school the same as studying in college?
No, it's not.
No.
No, it's not, right? So we see a lot of students that come out of high school and they're hypothesis testing, all right? They're checking out to see if their study skills in high school are what are going to work for them in college. And oftentimes they find pretty quickly that it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, some students take a lot longer to discover that, but just even trying those study skills is showing that you're testing those hypotheses. Now, again, college students are much more advanced than 12 years old. So usually what should happen, the natural trajectory is what? If a college student realizes that their study skills aren't working, what do you think the next thing is that they're going to do?
They'll try to find a different way that could work for them.
They'll either do trial and error. They'll try something different. They'll ask a friend what they're doing. They may even get a tutor or TikTok or YouTube, whatever forum they might have. They're going to try and discover different ways of studying. So that's a mile marker showing that if we're testing a hypothesis and we're asking, what if I do this, what will happen? Okay. And then trying to answer that. Okay. Okay. Let me see here. All right, so let me go through these slides here, and I think we're going to take a break at that point. All right, so Vygotsky's theory was that we learn based on information that we already know. So Lev Vygotsky came after Piaget, and there were some merits to Piaget that Vygotsky enjoyed, but it didn't really describe, if a child was not in an environment that was rich with those stimuli to help them with that cognitive development, how will they learn, right? So Lev Vygotsky proposed that we have certain things that we have to know in order to move beyond those stages, right? For example, how many of you would be able to take an algebra class without ever having taken a math class before? Probably none of you, or very few of you. I mean, I think it's very rare that somebody not having ever taken a math class is going to pick up algebra just like that. So anyway, Vygotsky said that there have to be certain things in place in order for learning to occur. And he called that scaffolding. So in order to learn algebra, you have to master basic math. You have to be able to think abstractly. You have to be able to replace information with either like or dissimilar information, right? And test those hypotheses. So that's what algebra is trying different things until you get a correct answer. So anyways, he stressed the importance of social interactions with other people, especially the idea of tutors. And I'm actually, since they don't have, actually, I'm not going to worry about that. So the idea of tutors is somebody that helps somebody go beyond what they already know. So for example, and I like the example, I like the term tutor because many of you are familiar with what a tutor is. So for example, you get into let's say a psychology class and you're having a difficult time understanding this. Some people may have had previous psychology classes or knew somebody that was in psychology classes or something. They had access to psychology information. So getting into a psychology class for somebody that has no previous information might be problematic. So, however, they do know themselves. They do know some terms that maybe they heard on Dr. Phil or Dr. Oz or Judge Judy. I don't know, whatever it is you watch. Does anybody watch Judge Judy still anymore?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. She's entertaining. She's really fiery, and I don't know. I think I appreciate it. I don't watch it religiously or anything, but when she's on, I just, it's funny. That tough love kind of stuff is intriguing to me. But anyway, through that zone of proximal development, we want to advance our skill sets a little bit. So we take what we know, and then we adopt what we call a tutor. And that tutor comes in and they help us take what we know and give us more information and relate it to information that we already know to expand our knowledge base a little bit wider so that learning can occur. And that's really the whole idea behind zone of proximal development. Vygotsky stressed that it is a social interaction because usually we can't do it on our own efficiently. Okay, we may eventually, through trial and error and circular motion, learn something beyond what we already know, but it might take a little bit longer, right, for some people than others. So that's the whole idea, is that we have somebody that that can tutor us, that can show us how to expand that and meet certain goals, either in education or through our skill sets at work or whatever. Okay. All right. So autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder encompassing a range of problems with thinking, feeling, language, and social skills. One thing I do want to caution is that there is no one model that, we can't look at one person and say they have the same type of features as another person and they can both have ASD, what we call autism spectrum disorder. Okay. So people are very different. Some people may have very good language skills, but they may not have good social skills, or they may think differently or feel differently, but yet they blend in. We used to have a term for that called Asperger's, when somebody was more higher functioning but lacked certain social skills. Now it all falls under the guise of autism spectrum disorder. So anyway, and there might be some different abilities, but the idea is having people with this diagnosis being able to, the goal is for them to be able to be self-sustaining, for them to live on their own with minimal interaction, with minimal intervention from somebody that's teaching them those skills, right? So just out of curiosity, they put this up here. What are some myths about autism that maybe some of you have had or heard that that's not true? Don't pay attention to the ASD and vaccines. We're not really talking about that. But what are some myths or characteristics of autism that you've heard or thought?
I've heard that they're not smart, but they actually, those people that have the disorder are actually a lot smarter than you think, but in like their own way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that used to be that used to be the stereotype, right? We operate in stereotypes sometimes because we want to make sense of things that we're seeing and interacting with. So one of the stereotypes was that it was a learning disorder. To some degree, that statement is correct. Not because they don't have that people with ASD have they don't have the capacity to learn. It's not that. It's that they learn differently. And you think about it, going back to Lev Vygotsky's model there, if we have to expand our knowledge through the use of tutors and people around us to teach us those skills, and if somebody with ASD isn't able to really be sociable and connect with somebody, that might be a problem. They might not be able to expand those skill sets without that interaction of another person. So you looking at things like an IEP, like an individual education plan or individualized education plan or something like that, helps to tailor how that child absorbs that information. It may not be through a conventional teacher. It may have to be through some kind of aid or somebody that can emotionally or somehow gain the trust of somebody with ASD to help them understand and help them communicate that information. Does that make sense? All right. So anyway, any other myths, any other things that you might have heard about ASD? All right. All right. Well, if nothing else, I'm going to stop here because, yeah, I want to get into psychosocial development. Eric Erickson's temperament we'll talk about. We'll pick up where we left off next week, or I'm sorry, next week, this upcoming Thursday. I'm way ahead here. All right. Any questions?
No, I don't think so.